All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Mindgasms. So, I am Andrew, aka Postmodern Fantasy Mindgasms, for the purposes of this chat. And I'm going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, postmodernism, along with one of my other favorite subjects, fantasy, postmodernism, and fantasy, and specifically the the series Malazan, written by Steven Erikson, a Canadian author, who is and Malazan is a 10-book epic grimdark character-driven fantasy series that has basically like a very difficult to figure out plot, and it's all show and no tell, so you don't get any exposition about what the magic system is like or how it works. And I'm going to talk about basically this, and there are no good and evil characters who are going on some specific quest and fulfilling specific goals, and you're not rooting for anyone in particular really, and it's hard to even figure out who the main character is. There isn't even one really, but it's also a super massive world, and I love it because there's all this super awesome magic and fantasy stuff, like cool magical creatures like gods and a demon who turns into a shape-shifting dragon, and dragon fights and magic fights between mages and witches and all sorts of cool shit like that. So I'm going to talk about Malazan fantasy and how evil so-called postmodernists who are actually post-structuralists like Foucault and Derrida, who and actually never use the term post-structuralists even to describe themselves, and Derrida talking about his famous, often misquoted quote that there's nothing outside the text, which was actually there's nothing outside the context, meaning that there's nothing outside the relevant context of whatever text that you're reading. So everything has a relevant context. And then Foucault, and they're both famous for deconstruction, which was the method that Derrida used in particular that was later called that. He never used that term, and a lot of you know that I talk about Foucault a lot on this channel, and talk about how he breaks down different terms and categories, and how these different categorizations were thought up by specific institutions during the Enlightenment, like uh, like religion, science, and government, and how they created these categories. Like, for example, when I talk about his book, History of Sexuality, he talks about how the category of homosexual was created, and then the institutions of science, psychiatry, and biology and psychology determined that if you are gay, then you are sinful, and literally psychiatrically and diagnosably and scientifically insane. You have a mental disorder if you're gay. And so that's a little bit off topic in terms of Malazan because there are no gay characters. But basically, Steven Erikson deconstructs these traditional tropes about fantasy, like token fantasy tropes that we'll get into here. So I'm going to describe postmodern literature and then get a little bit into an awesome nerdy video with uh, Philip Chase and AP, who talk about narrative structure and norms and othering and normalcy and so-called evil postmodern literature techniques. And of course, I've described before that many times, some of you are aware of, that there's a difference between the postmodern era, the postmodern condition, and postmodernism. And postmodern literature and postmodern art have nothing to do with so-called postmodernism in terms of philosophy, like Foucault and Derrida. People who study literature have decided to use similar techniques that people like Foucault and Derrida specifically use to break down traditional tropes and devices in narratives. And Steven Erikson does this really well in his Malazan series. So anyway, my eyesight has gotten bad here, so I need to on to read this. This is just the Wikipedia definition, and the definition of postmodern it can change sometimes, and so this is relatively accurate, I would say, in terms of my study of so-called postmodernism and writers like the works of writers like Derrida and Foucault in general. But this is a fairly good definition. Postmodern literature is a form of literature that is characterized by the use of metafiction, unreliable narration, self-reflexivity, intertextuality, and which often themselves both historical and which often thematizes both historical and political issues. This style of experimental literature emerged strongly in the United States in the 1960s through the writings of writers such as Kurt Vonnegut. A lot of you have heard of him, Slaughterhouse-Five and a ton of other just weird and abnormal forms of literature that jump around in terms of time structure and are somewhat satirical and over the top. Thomas Peyton, William Gaddis, I've never heard of him. Philip K. Dick, of course, famous science fiction author who wrote Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which was, of course, famously made into Blade Runner. And he wrote a whole bunch of other famous science fiction books. I also did a movie versus book comparison of his short story Minority Report that also got made into a movie, of course. And he wrote the short story called Total Recall that, of course, got made into that movie with Arnold, and then the shitty remake with Colin Farrell. And John Berth, and I thought Hunter S. Thompson was on this list here, but he, I mean, you could say that in terms of in that his literature is postmodern in some ways, and that it's so over the top in the way that he describes people and events, right? Postmodernists often challenge authorities, which has been seen as a symptom of the fact that this style of literature first emerged in the context of political tendencies in the 1960s. The inspiration is, among other things, even through how postmodern literature is highly self-reflexive about this political issues it speaks to. Yeah, it really postmodern literature tends to really closely examine political and historical issues, even if it doesn't do so explicitly, like Kurt Vonnegut, for example. It's just there's no direct criticism. It's all satirical. And I'd say with Steven Erikson in his fantasy series, that's true as well. That he really focuses on political and historical issues, but he's not like beating you over the head with it and being heavy-handed. Again, he's not moralizing for any of the characters throughout the books. He's just presenting them to you and allowing you to choose which characters to root for, which is another thing that's totally different from traditional ideas, right? There are no good characters who are on an epic quest to defeat evil and save the world, and all this sort of traditional narrative structure and that sort of thing. So yeah, I'm going to go through some of this video, not all of it. I'm going to skip around a little bit, and they mostly only talk about Malazan specifically at the start of this, but yeah, we'll get into this here.
Today, I thought an interesting thing to talk about, I think, in relation to fantasy is the othering of other fantasy races and how it is done quite often from the point of view of a reader surrogate.
So this term othering, especially in terms of postmodern literature, is a very commonly used one, like how and they get into this in terms of normalcy too, in terms of when we're distinguishing between different fantasy races, there's one is considered most normal. So in Tolkien, for example, in Lord of the Rings, we're actually identifying with the hobbits the most, but also we look at the men, we look at the hobbits in relation to the men, and the men in relation to the elves, and obviously there are other versions of halflings, and there are many other versions of elves and men that have been in many other fantasy series, and you can take the vantage point of any of those different races being the protagonist. So like what you use to define how you like what type of character, the lens through which you view other characters determines how you see those characters, obviously, right? Like if basically the main character is a man and then he's going around with these elves and dwarves and hobbits, then you're viewing the other different races from that perspective, and then it's going to be different if it's from the perspective of an elf or a dwarf or a hobbit in the Lord of the Rings or any other fantasy series. And then in Malazan, they're I think they're well, no, they're human characters, and then there are different types of people with different types of magic powers, and then there are different types of fantasy creatures and magical monsters and all kinds of awesome hardcore fantasy stuff like that.
You probably know what I mean here. Do you want to explain that for anyone who did not follow all of the jumbled up jargon words that I just used, or will I take a stab at
it? I mean, I'll start it and then you can take up wherever you like. But basically what I hear you saying there is, and the classic example, maybe it helps to give an example, like Lord of the Rings, where the human surrogate in the story, the person's most closely aligned to our perspective would be the hobbits, because most of us are not epic characters from mythology. We're not kings, we're not elves, we're not dwarves, we're human. And the hobbits, even though they're halflings, pretty much they're our stand-ins, right? We most clearly identify with them. They take our place in this world where we feel the sense of awe and wonder at some of the bigger, more epic aspects of that world. That's how we would feel if I would think if you and I were thrown into Middle Earth and we were given a vision of Lothlorien, we would be pretty impressed, right? We would be in awe.
That's another aspect of traditional fantasy tropes that, well, just in any genre, really, that's useful. If you're exploring a new world, often authors come up with a character for whom that world is new, so they can have an excuse for someone to have exposition scenes at them in which they are explaining how the world works and how they can navigate their way through it, since they're not used to any of these massive cultural changes, and there can be technological or magical aspects, of course, if we're talking about science fiction and fantasy, obviously. And then one thing that's different about the Malazan series is that there isn't this. Like I said, it's all show, no tell. There's virtually no exposition, although there's a little bit more in the second book, Deadhouse Gates. I've only read the first two so far, but it's almost entirely show and no tell. So you're just dropped into the story, and all of these characters have already experienced a lot of what they're going through. And when they go through new situations, often people don't really explain things to them, because like in reality, someone who's with you, who's on your side, will explain how things work when you're getting to them. But there are going to be people who, if they're sharing the same type of unique fantasy world, which is very different from our own in a lot of different ways, they're going to know a lot of aspects about how the world is working already and how the magic system works and stuff. So you're not going to have to explain, for example, how the magic system works. And it works with warrens in Malazan, which actually are physical places that you can pull magic from and store things in and stuff, which is really fascinating. But yeah, anyway, that's definitely not how it works in Malazan.
I think, wouldn't you?
Well, we would be, but I can just imagine other people going, what's your Wi-Fi password? I'm not getting a signal on my phone. Gladriel, sort this out.
That's kind of where you're going, though, right?
Yeah, essentially, when we think of all of these,
go back a little there.
And
it would feel if I would think if you and I were thrown into Middle Earth and we were given a vision of Lothlorien, we would be pretty impressed, right? We would be in awe. I think, wouldn't you?
Well, we would be, but I can just imagine other people going, "What's your Wi-Fi password?" I'm not getting a signal on my phone. Galadriel, sort this out.
That's kind of where you're going, though, right?
And seriously, though, that would seem like a different type of magic to people in Middle-earth, for example, or other fantasy realms. What is this magic phone that you have that tells you information and answers any question for you? And you can also use it to magically talk with other people who are long distances away, and all of these other sorts of capabilities that it has.
Right.
Yeah, essentially, when we think of all of these fantasy worlds, and there are so many amazing fantasies, but quite often at the heart of them, there is either the callow youth character, which we've talked about before, that it's the young character who goes out into the wider world and needs the world explained to them. Their level of ignorance matches the level of ignorance of the reader. And so as the character explores the world, so does the reader. And that's one way of doing it. And the base norm then is established with usually some relationship between that character as reader surrogate, that they are our portal into the world, our way of understanding the world.
Yeah.
And in a lot of fantasy then, even when they're not an inexperienced youth, when they are a seasoned veteran or anything like this, quite often the point of view character, the normal level, the diegetic reality, is attuned to the human base norm. So if we think in a fantasy realm and we take the classic Tolkien elves, the elves are long lived. And you go, well, not if you're an elf. If you're an elf, you live the regular amount of time. Humans are short lived. And that is really the simplest way to illustrate this. If elves are long lived, we have taken a perspective of what the base norm is as you live this long, and elves live longer than that.
The human lifespan is considered normal, and the elven lifespan is considered elongated because it's much longer than the human lifespan. So obviously he's saying that they're not measuring. It's not measured based on the elven lifespan as being normal, rather than the human lifespan as being normal. So if the elf lifespan were normal instead of the human lifespan, then it would be considered normal, or then the elven lifespan would be considered normal, and the human lifespan would be considered abnormally short.
Than that, so they are other, they are strange, and that base norm is what's being applied for the narrative itself, for the diegetic sort of experience. And very often that is associated or used to normalize things for the reader. And that's why we have humans at the center of all of these stories, or when they try to do something different, when you go, oh, but the main character of my story is an orc. And you go, right, how orcish is the orc?
Yeah.
Does the orc think of humans as being beautiful and long-lived, the way that humans think of elves?
And we could say that in terms of the example of how orcish is the orc, we can talk about how Tolkien tropes themselves of how of what creatures like elves and different races like elves and orcs and dwarves and hobbits rather are like is considered normal, and then things that are versions of elves, dwarves, hobbits, and other races that are extremely different from the Tolkien tropes are considered abnormal, because the Tolkien tropes in fantasy are considered normal
as being beautiful and long-lived. Or does the orc
that's
think of...
and that's why a lot of stuff that happens in Malazan is considered abnormal, because there's not this traditional narrative structure, 5 acts, where this underdog like a hobbit is going on an epic quest to, if we're talking about in the Hobbit, to steal some gold from a dragon and get a magic stone, for Thorin to get a magic stone back that is in his family's legacy, or a way broader in scope story in the Lord of the Rings, where an underdog is going on an epic quest to destroy a magical object and save the world from evil, and he is good and Sauron is evil, and there are clear goals that all of the characters are defining. There are good and evil characters. There's an ultimate end goal. You are rooting for specific characters. These are all things that are considered normal, whereas in Malazan, like I said, you're not rooting for specific characters. There's no there's no distinction between good and evil, no clear distinction anyway. You can root for whoever you want to. It's not like totally grimdark as Game of Thrones in that everyone is doing something evil and there are different shades of gray. It's that people are doing good things and bad things, and there are bad people who do good things and there are good people who do bad things, which is way more realistic, just like real life. And they're fulfilling goals, but we aren't directly explained what they are all the time, and there isn't this broad and epic part for each book. It works way better as a full series. But like I said in my review of the first Malazan video, it's not slow paced at all, which is why I like it, because why I love both books so far, because they're all these awesome magic battles and fascinating fantasy creatures and an intricate and detailed magic system, which is very difficult to figure out, but I'm sure I'll learn more and more as I go on. And I don't get bored because, like I said, there's so much action with so much awesome magic stuff, with awesome, fascinating fantasy creatures like gods and wizards and dragons fighting each other, and awesome, fascinating stuff like that, and assassins in civil wars and assassins guild and so on. Yeah.
Think of itself as being brutish and applying basically the human thought process and the comparison and contrast to humans as your base level.
There are some interesting series in this regard too. Malazan springs to mind.
Surprise.
Where I think our representatives in the Malazan Book of the Fallen are most nearly, for me anyway, the bridge burners and the bone hunters, the ordinary, soldiers there who are surrounded by entities that are way more powerful and typically way more long-lived than they are.
That's true. Yeah, there's some characters who are gods or demons who are resurrected people, or just because of magic live for like as much as hundreds of thousands of years. Some of them are basically immortal. And then there are just regular human characters without even magic powers who are in soldiers. And a lot of this is military fantasy, so it's just regular soldiers and regular wars, who some of whom are often facing magical creatures and characters with magic powers. That's where it gets really fascinating.
And yet Malazan does something a little different, I feel, too, because we end up identifying with characters of other races to some degree, I think, right? I mean, that's a deliberate thing, like Jagut, for example. And the Erikson and Esselman.
In book one, one of the characters is a raven, and one of them is an animated and sentient puppet with the soul of a sentient creature. So there's a puppet and a raven, and like there are demons. There are some perspectives from these wolf hounds, or like evil demon hounds. Like I said, there are gods, dragons, all sorts of different creatures that whose perspectives we see in the books. So it's very interesting.
Are playing with this otherized trope, aren't they? Yeah. With something like Daggett, who are clearly kind of orc in their appearance, but they are so sophisticated and so hilarious. So obviously they're tweaking us a little bit with that, aren't they?
Okay, but would we describe the Jagged as living a normal lifespan, or would we describe them as long-lived?
Long-lived, right? Yeah.
So our base norm is still rooted in the human experience.
Yes. Yeah, the ordinary, the fiddlers of the world. That's us, right there.
So even if we go back to your example of The Lord of the Rings, and you go, well, how do we like the Hobbits? And you go, well, the Hobbits live into their mid-100s. Oh, that's much older than we. But Aragorn, as the sort of the prototypical example of the best of men, the best of humans, lives in excess of 200 years. So lives much longer than the Hobbits. The dwarves live longer than the Hobbits. The elves live longer than the Hobbits. So from the Hobbit perspective, everyone else is kind of long-lived. Now, obviously, that's because Aragorn is descended from Numenor rather than the sort of the base level men. There are subtleties and nuances there. But you can see that argument that the Hobbits because they are rooted in that experience, form that base level reality through which we perceive the rest of the world, the wider fantastical world. It's immersive.
Yep.
And so the
Jump
Belters
ahead
have
here.
a very
Oh, they're talking
specific
about the
culture
Expanse.
that they use, base level exploration. And you think even in science fiction, when we go to these far off, bizarre alien worlds, it's almost always with a human or an actual human as our point of view character, because otherwise we have no way of grasping how alien the alien is. And one of the few series, I think, on TV and books that did this quite well was The Expanse. Because when you're in those cultures, the cultures aren't explained to you.
It's a really awesome sci-fi series. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it.
You just experience them. It's immersive. And so the Belters have a very specific culture that they use. But again, all of The Expanse is basically about humans. And so it's shades of humanity rather than truly otherizing. It's a much more nuanced form of otherizing, as opposed to the kind of quite blunt elf, troll, orc, human.
Yeah, it is a much more nuanced otherizing of different types of humans on different planets specifically. If we're talking about The Expanse, because they're what are called Earthers in the series, who obviously are people who are born on at least people who are born on Earth, even if they live on other planets, are considered Earthers. And obviously everyone who lives on Earth is an Earther too. And then there are the people who lives on Mars. I'm not sure if they're actually called Martians in the series. I don't remember, but they have their own distinct cultures, and they distinguish themselves very clearly from Earth too, along with the Belters, who are people who have been living on and working in the asteroid belts at the edge of our solar system for so many generations that their bodies have adapted to the difference in environment and have become much skinnier due to the difference in gravity. And they have their own distinct culture too, and they have their own distinct accent, and they're all tattooed with specific symbols too. So the Belters have their own very distinct culture in comparison to the people who live on Mars and the Earthers in that series. So that's one of the many reasons that it's a very fascinating and awesome science fiction series.
These very blunt categorizations.
I agree. Yeah, there's nuance, and I thought of Star Trek when you said that about science fiction and the various iterations of Star Trek. In fact, if I go back to the one I'm most familiar with, which is the original, you have a basically human perspective with Captain Kirk and the others, but you do have Spock, right, who's sort of half human and half Vulcan. And one of the interesting things they're doing there is they're exploring a slightly non-human perspective. That's part of what the series is about, though, right? I mean,
yeah, but Spock is always contrasted to the base human norm.
Exactly, and he's got those two halves too. Yeah,
and also, I mean, if you think if an episode of Star Trek was a brand new alien species, and the entire episode was just this alien species going about like their struggle, and then at the very end, Kirk beamed down to go, "Aha, we're here to do that." It'd be very difficult to understand what was going on, because we don't have that perspective. We have to have that assumption of the human norm. James Eng's The Wolf Age, which I think does the othered race of the werewolf so well, to almost
I haven't heard of that one.
Of the reading experience with the
names
which
ahead
I've talked
here.
about before.
The unpronounceable pup.
Automatically shocked.
Oh,
you
I don't
are
want Malazan
out
spoilers.
Because when that is your base level of reality, you
I'm
wouldn't
just gonna
explain
go
it to
way
anyone.
ahead a little
So
bit
if
here.
you're to put this,
I have a college essential that every student can use to make their work.
Skip this shit. There we go.
if you have an entire society of elves and no human characters, and you're telling an elvish story set in an elvish city with elvish characters, they are never going to see each other as strange and ethereal. They're going to see them the way that we see each other, as in normal. And as soon as the characters see everything around them as normal, how do you represent that they are not human? That they are strange and ethereal? Because they're only strange and ethereal from a human perspective, not from an elvish perspective. So creating that level of mundanity reduces the level of the fantastic reality in the diegesis down to the mundane. And then you think about, well, if you then introduce a human character, how would you make the human character look? You've assumed the elves as the base norm. So the humans, think of how we think of elves. They're tall, they are beautiful, they are ethereal. So you would do the opposite. You would have your human characters. They would be short, they would be
crude.
They would be ugly. That's how you would cast it, to show the elvish level of sort of mundanity and how they would see humans.
But you're describing the Silmarillion right now, essentially.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, the earlier parts after the creation part, the earlier parts of the Silmarillion, just elves.
Yeah, the earlier parts of the Silmarillion, literally ages pass before the humans exist. I think at least the entire first age happens before humans exist, if I remember correctly, in the Silmarillion, which, for those of you who don't know, obviously is the kind of mythology and history behind the world of the Lord of the Rings. It's like a fake history book, and it's very dense, but also very worthwhile if you want to nerd out about all the details about Lord of the Rings.
Humans are the latecomers. We're the second children of Iluvatar. And when we come along, you know,
Iluvatar is the original god of Middle Earth, basically.
Elves are like, ugh. You know what I mean? We're brutish and short-lived, and that's the perspective initially of the humans. It is an elvish perspective. So yeah, in a way, I mean, I don't know if Tolkien, I mean, obviously the Silmarillion is not the perfect example because it's a bunch of different stories put together, but you see what I mean, right?
Yeah, it's kind of an anthology, the Silmarillion.
Yeah, and it hasn't been smoothed out into a single narrative. It's slightly inconsistent in its register.
Yeah.
Explores how,
and also like a lot of mythological books or holy texts, Tolkien contradicts himself in some places, especially if you're talking about all of his other fake history books, like the Silmarillion, like the 12-volume History of Middle Earth that his son Christopher Tolkien published posthumously after Tolkien's death. And you know, he did some edits, but he has notes throughout saying that this is one version of what happened, and here are like 4 different other versions. He was changing a lot of stuff as he wrote it, which is that basically happens a lot in the Silmarillion too. There are many different versions of the fall of Gondolin, for example, a lot of very famous events in the history of Middle Earth. So that's part of why the Silmarillion is very difficult to read, and the history of Middle Earth and all of those other similar books are too.
As a half elf, he decides to grow a beard.
Oh, I'm going to go back a little bit.
Accepted, even though he
get explored, I think, in both those examples pretty well.
And in fact, like one of the often academically derided series, the Dragonlance series by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, a central character in that is Tanis Half-Elf. And part of the storyline explores how, as a half-elf, he decides to grow a beard because he's not accepted, even though he lived a lot of his life in the elf realm.
Yeah.
He wasn't accepted there. And when he comes into the human realm, in order to fit in, it's better to have a beard because his ears single him out. You know, he doesn't fit in either world. And it's absolutely fine for a series that a lot of people criticize. There are some fascinating things being done in a way that was easily accessible in mainstream genre fiction based on a role-playing game. And it questioned that concept of hybridity or even code switching and aspects of personality. And we can see how that then gets explored in a more general sense and can be a...
That's interesting and different too, because other than for the reasons they're mentioning, if we're talking about normalcy for elves, like Tolkien's example, there are half elves in there. Like Elrond, for example, is half elven, which is never mentioned in Lord of the Rings, I don't think. Maybe in the books, but definitely not the movies. And that's definitely an aspect that we learn about in the history of Middle Earth and the Silmarillion, etc. That Elrond himself is only half elven, but why I'm talking about how what is considered a normal half elf even in traditional fantasy is that when you're half elven, Elrond, for example, is as far as I understand, just basically considered a full elf, and he lives his life as an elf. He doesn't really ever seem overly human. He seems much more elven throughout the Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion and stuff. Um, but yeah, so that's that example of that half elf trying to look more human because he doesn't fit into either the elven or the human societies is definitely postmodern in the sense that it's not traditional, even in the sense of what is considered the normal half elf if we're talking about Tolkien and traditional fantasy tropes.
Applied in a more general sense to, as you said, people with parents from different cultures or different ethnicities or different religions, depending on your part of the world. And because of that, there can be an element of code switching and an element of not fitting in and trying to understand these things. And it all has to do with this perception of the base norm. And if you are part of the assumed base norm, you never see it.
Yeah.
But if you're not part of that base norm, it is amazing how obvious it is in places.
Yeah.
We are blind quite often to those things.
Yep. And the people who are half base norm and half other really have, I think, an interesting perception on all of that. So, yeah. But interesting what you do.
Yeah. And it is the concept of otherness. We've talked about this before, but otherness is not necessarily a bad thing. We talk about othering, and quite often it's viewed in a very negative sense because it is a simplistic othering of someone. But othering as a tool, if you are one of the accepted majority to suddenly being a minority somewhere, shifts your.
So not only do you understand the broader world more, you understand yourself more because you have that perception of yourself from the outside now.
And that it's a fascinating to go from being, say, one of the accepted majority to suddenly being a minority somewhere shifts your perception radically. Going from one culture to an entirely different culture, or even one that is close, but not quite. And quite often it's the little changes then that trip you up, that you go, oh, didn't see that because it was so close to normal. And this concept of the base norm and othering and what we see in fantasy, I think, has very strong parallels to our own lives about our perception of what is normal. And that applies outside of fiction then to how we see the world around us. And again, like as we always say, reading broadly, reading widely, reading deeply, all of these things broaden and deepen and enrich our understanding, not only of the literature, not only of ourselves, but of the world that we actually live in. And I think one of the great strengths is it makes us more flexible and adaptable.
Yeah, I agree. I think that one of the impulses at the heart of fantasy is to explore and to venture out. And that is inevitably going to lead to a different person at the end of the journey, both the character and the reader. And that's really part of the beauty of the genre, isn't it?
Yeah. But anything else that you would like to add? This was a fun discussion because it popped into my head about these assumptions that we make about other fantasy races. And I thought it would be fun to discuss. So is there anything that you want to add to this, Philip?
Just that it has been fun having this conversation with you, my friend, and interacting with you, with my nemesis, is always a very culturally enlightening experience. So, I thank you for that, and I thank your viewers for putting up with me again.
And for those of you still watching, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and we will see you in the next one.
Oh, I forgot my mic was muted. I thought that was a really interesting subject to get into, and I wanted to comment on that video and talk about how Malazan specifically is postmodern. It's definitely postmodern fantasy, I would say. And, to massively oversimplify, it's basically because it doesn't follow any of the traditional tropes to do with fantasy. There, there is basically no clear distinction between good and evil. There are no characters uh, there are no heroes going on an epic quest to destroy evil. They're in Malazan, there are all sorts of different characters, and there's no moralization on the part of Steven Erikson. You are basically given the perspective of many different characters and then not explained really much of what's going on in terms of the plot or in terms of how the characters relate to each other or in terms of how the magic system works. Kind of have to gradually figure that out as you go along. But I like just looking at it, just reading them for fun and enjoying all the awesome magic battles and stuff. And then gradually figuring out the details of the broader world as they go along. And I think that's really fascinating. So yeah, well, like I said, Malazan is a really awesome series, is a really awesome postmodern fantasy series, in my opinion. And yeah, definitely check it out. All right. So thanks everyone again for watching. Check out my last video on Malazan, which is my review of the first book, Gardens of the Moon. Check out my upcoming review of Dead House Gates, book 2, fairly soon. Might make that one spoiler free too, like I did with the first one, because like I said, it's hard to figure out what's going on anyway. So I might do that one spoiler free too. And I basically didn't include any spoilers for Malazan in this video too. So yeah, I thought it would be fun to combine some of my favorite topics into one video. Postmodernism, which I do a lot of solo videos about, and fantasy, which I do a lot of sometimes solo videos and also a lot of podcasts with my fantasy nerd friends Dusty and Tristram. So yeah, thanks everyone again for watching. Subscribe to the channel, click that bell to be notified when I come out with new videos. Probably sometime this week, I'm going to be talking with Daniele Bolelli, the historian who I've talked with before, comparing the Lord of the Rings of Power shows and the House of the Dragon show, of course, the prequel to Game of Thrones, and talk about why one of them sucks and one of them is awesome, at least by comparison. And also this upcoming weekend, I'm going to do a podcast with Dusty about Children of Dune, which is the third book in the original Dune series by Frank Herbert. So check that out as well. And also check out my Patreon page. Link is in the description as always. And please give me any amount of money per month that you want, 1, 10, 100. You can vote on future topics, books, and movies that I will discuss both by myself and with others. If you contribute, I think it's $10 a month to my Patreon or more. And yeah, like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, like I always say, always remember this: the funk cures all, and groove is in the heart. And Malazan is an awesome postmodern fantasy series. You should definitely read it. All right. Thanks again, everyone, and adios until next time.